Your lecturer is Dr. Robert. Dr. Bucholz has taught at Loyola University Chicago, where he is professor of history and an expert on subjects in early modern London, early modern England, and English social history. Among his numerous teaching awards are the Sujak Award for Teaching Excellence, the highest such award presented by the Loyola College of Arts and Sciences.
These lectures are titled Foundation 2, A History of the Modern Western World, Part 1.
Welcome to one of the great intellectual experiences of your life. Now, that rather bold statement has nothing to do with me and my limited talents. It has everything to do with the subject that you have so wisely chosen to study. Together, we will explore the history that has arguably done more to shape your world than any other, that of Western Europe from the 16th century to the present day. Wherever we come from, whatever we believe, however we make a living, Americans are all, to a greater or lesser extent, inhabitants of a world shaped by the last 5 centuries of Western history and culture. Over those 5 centuries, the Western world has seen a profound transformation, which should raise some questions. How was it that the decentralized agrarian principalities of medieval Europe became great industrial nation-states? How and why did absolutism rise, then yield to democratic liberalism? How did Western science and technology create the first industrialized economies and reduce the power of superstition and disease? Why did Europe produce 2 great antagonistic economic systems, capitalism and communism? Why did Westerners conquer half the world, then lose it? And above all, has this legacy been, on the whole, positive or negative? This course will explore the ideas, the events, the characters that molded the political, social, religious, intellectual, cultural, scientific, and economic history during the most tumultuous period between the 16th and the 21st centuries. We will examine absolutism and the challenges it provoked, the Enlightenment, the French and American revolutions, the spread of constitutionalism, liberalism, nationalism, the Industrial Revolution, socialism, imperialism, the Russian Revolution, 2 world wars, fascism, communism, decolonization, the collapse of the Soviet bloc, democratization, and the issues confronting contemporary Western society. Along the way, we will encounter some of the most brilliant thoughts, the most fascinating stories, the most intriguing people that the whole soap opera of human history has to offer. But, Professor Bucholz, you might well ask, how relevant is that soap opera really to the very real dramas that we face today at the dawn of the 21st century? What do dead Europeans have to tell us about our problems? In any case, isn't it our particular genius as Americans that we've escaped from the past and that as the most powerful society in the history of the planet, we can make our own reality? I have a rather long answer for that. In fact, the whole course is sort of an answer to that. But let's start with a basic fact. This is a course in European history. I say that without apology. I know, and I hope that you know, that there are many histories, many her stories, if you will, that are deep and rich and well worth studying. I mean, of course, those of the native cultures of East Asia, the subcontinent of India, Africa, the Middle East, North and South America. Many of us in North America can trace our backgrounds and ancestors to these non-European cultures. So, aren't they more relevant to our lives than the culture sometimes dismissed as that of dead white men? What do we have in common with French peasants of the 18th century, English workers of the 19th century, Russian soldiers of the 20th? As I hope to demonstrate quite a bit as it turns out, but in the meantime, let me state unequivocally that I don't teach this course either here before the cameras and microphones or at my university because I think Western civilization or European culture is inherently superior to or more advanced than or better than these other civilizations. Quite frankly, I don't think you can rate civilizations like college football teams. And if you read the sports section in January, you know you can't even do that with any degree of reliability. If measured by technological advance, sure, Western civilization clearly wins, at least right now. But if we were to measure a society by, say, its ability to coexist with the natural world, those of Native Americans and Mongolian tribesmen would actually look a lot better than ours. So we fall back on the old question. Why should we study the West? Why should Americans concern themselves with the history of Europe? Because, like it or not, it was from Europe. European thinkers, European traditions, European conflicts, European experiments, that we in the West derived our system of government, democracy for most Western countries, the organization of our society into classes, our economic structure, capitalism, our literature, much of our art and music, the media of our public discourse, television, radio, newspapers, novels, are all by and large, for the most part, European inventions. And above all, certain core ideas. The notion that all men, and now all women, are created equal. No taxation without representation. The people, united, can never be defeated. A free press. A limited government. The idea that those accused of crimes are innocent until proven guilty, and that they are entitled to be judged by a jury of their peers. All of these ideas were developed during the course of European history. All reached fruition during the period of our course. Far from celebrating dead white men, it is these ideas which have given the world the most powerful tools to fight the hegemony of European empires, and for all people of all colors to achieve justice and freedom. When oppressed or disenfranchised groups, the poor, women, racial or ethnic groups, the disabled, gay men and women, in any of the 5 continents, argue for justice and equality, they argue over and with these very concepts. In the United States, they've been enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, which were written by men like Madison and Jefferson, who were themselves students of, in a sort of figurative sense, John Locke, Montesquieu, the histories of 17th and 18th century Europe, and indeed ultimately of the Magna Carta, Roman law, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and the Bible. If I may, I'd like to take just one American example, Martin Luther King. Now, most years I teach this course in the spring. We usually begin around mid-January, which means that the first lecture, this lecture, generally falls around the time of the Martin Luther King holiday. Now, it may seem off topic, but I'd like you to consider for a moment the life of this one rather extraordinary American. He was named for his father, a Baptist preacher who was, of course, named for the great 16th century Protestant reformer, Martin Luther. He is Dr. Martin Luther King because he earned a doctorate at Boston University. The university, in the sense of an institution which awards degrees or credentials for academic knowledge, is of course a European invention dating back to the Middle Ages. King received his doctorate for dissertation on the German-American theologian Paul Tillich. Now, Tillich was a graduate of the University of Breslau in Germany. In World War I, he fought on the German side. He was dismissed from his post at the University of Frankfurt and eventually forced to flee Nazi Germany to America. Eventually, he taught at Harvard and the University of Chicago. Can we agree that his life spans many of the great controversies and issues of the first half of the 20th century? King was also profoundly influenced by Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian political leader, but, and this is often forgotten, a graduate of an English law school in 1888. Now, I could argue that Gandhi's entire life boiled down to forcing the British to live up to the enlightened democratic ideals that he had learned from them. So here's another life with a profound impact on Western civilization. King's writings and speeches, like Tillich's, demonstrate deep knowledge of Christian scripture, but also the profound influence of much intervening culture. They're positively drenched with the language and cadences of the King James Bible, Shakespeare, the Founding Fathers, English common law, Jesus, and equality and nonviolence are rooted in similar fights in European history. So here is this great American, perhaps, if one measures by what he accomplished, the greatest American of the 20th century, of African descent, and yet himself a product through and through of Western culture and its turbulent history. Now, I don't want to oversell this idea of Europe's gifts to the world. If you pay attention to this course or just watch the news, you will know that Europeans have spent an awful lot of time fighting over and against these very ideas, and often killing each other and other non-Europeans in wars, revolutions, and general inhumanity to their fellow humans. One notes continuing tensions often leading to ruthless violence in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Chechnya, and continuing European debates about anti-Semitism, immigration, public welfare, Europe's role in the world, the latter, in part, a bitter legacy of European imperialism. In the last lecture, I want to suggest that the Europeans may actually have found their way past some of these issues in a way which Americans might want to study. But in the meantime, and in any case, despite these disputes and madnesses, I remain convinced that European ideals of and debates about equality and inequality, justice and injustice, class and power, reason and revelation, science and technology remain our world's last best hope, to quote an American president, himself named after an English county, that's Lincoln, himself steeped in the King James Bible and the traditions of English common law, our last best hope to achieve a society with liberty and justice for all. That alone seems to me a pretty good reason for spending time on this story, these ideals, and the place and the peoples which forged them. Okay, fine. Maybe I've sold you on this. But what gives me the right and the background to tell you this story? Well, I'm a professor of British history at Loyola University of Chicago, where I've taught this course every year for the past 15. If you want to know more details about me, you can read them in the booklet or look me up on the Teaching Company website. In the meantime, I want to make two basic points about myself. It should be obvious by now from my accent that I am an American. This is very much a course presented by an American for his fellow Americans. I like to think that my long apprenticeship in studying this people and this culture have given me a pretty good insight into what Americans are likely to know and not know, what they're likely to be interested in and not interested in about the history of Western civilization. If I'm wrong, you'll undoubtedly find ways of letting me know. The second thing I'd like to do here is issue a little bit of a disclaimer. This course covers a lot of ground, the whole of human life across an entire continent and its extensions across the globe for 5 centuries. Anyone who teaches this course has to know about 16th century theology and the 19th century factory system and U-boats and British parliamentary politics and the experience of French peasants and Russian serfs and the internal problems of Ulster and Kosovo and countless lands beyond Europe. So if I sometimes seem less than omniscient, I hope that you will forgive me, as I too remain a student of Western civilization. Now, on the other hand, if I often seem biased towards the west of Europe, Great Britain in particular, that is more conscious. That is a result of both circumstance and conviction. The circumstance is that my specific area of research is Great Britain during the Tudor and Stuart period. That's what Loyola originally hired me to teach. This is the part of the world whose history I know best. I can't help that. The conviction, though, is that of all the countries of the West, it is Britain, British political and social institutions, from which we in America have derived most of our heritage, proof to follow. So what's the underlying philosophy of this course? I've been sneaking it in on you. That may seem an odd question. Does history really need an underlying philosophy? History's pretty straightforward, isn't it? You begin at the beginning, you march on to the end, one darn thing after another in chronological order. Don't you? 50 years ago, I might very well have launched in with Ferdinand and Isabella bankrolling Columbus, or Henry VIII beheading his wives, Louis XIV building Versailles. All these people had issues, by the way. I would then have carried on through the dynastic and political changes in Europe with special attention to Napoleon and Bismarck and Hitler and Stalin and Churchill, and left off with the fall of the Soviet Union and the foundation of the European Union. That is, for most of the past 500 years, the history of the West has been told as if it were the history of about 12 people. That is, the history of kings and queens, premiers and dictators. Now, let me reassure you, you will be getting plenty of kings and queens and premiers and dictators. They're undoubtedly one of the reasons you signed up for the course, And you can't beat him for ringing declarations and shocking pronouncements. Elizabeth I proclaiming, "I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Louis XIV bypassing anatomy altogether to declare, "I am the state." Frederick the Great one downing him after reading his Voltaire by asserting, "No, I am the servant of the state." Otto von Bismarck spurning even assertions themselves with, "The great questions of time are not decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood." The example of Louis XIV reminds us that kings and queens are great for scandal. Henry VIII had his 6 wives. Louis XV had his mistresses. Madame de Pompadour's power will feature in this course. Or for fascinating anecdotes. One of my favorites is Maria Theresa in 1740, Austria and Hungary, beset by enemies. She goes to the Hungarian Diet with her children, and she holds them up to the Diet. And she says, "You must defend these children. You must defend this dynasty." One of those children grew up to become Emperor Joseph II, who was famous for telling Mozart, who had just written The Marriage of Figaro, that it had too many notes. Another great anecdote is that of Napoleon crowning himself. There's also Wilhelm I in the Ems Dispatch, and of course, Churchill, Churchill, Churchill. These are all great stories and sources of great stories. But within the past half century, historians have come to realize that they're not the whole story. Because at any given time, there were between 80 million and 800 million other people in Europe whose stories need to be told. The problem with making this course a story of kings and queens, and in my view, the problem with biography as history generally, is that it creates the impression that the histories of great nations were simply manifestations of the plans, the passions, and the whims of about 12 or 20 people. Now, sometimes that may seem to be true. Take one of the most important events described in this course, the Reformation. It was obviously catalyzed by Martin Luther's doubts about the Catholic doctrine on indulgences. But do we really believe that if Luther hadn't had those doubts or kept his mouth shut, that there wouldn't have been a Reformation? Or that once he decided to nail the 95 Theses on the Württemberg church door, the whole thing happened like clockwork? The first ignores a growing movement, often among ordinary people, that seems to have wanted Reformation in Europe. The second ignores the immense loyalty or inertia that many Europeans had for Catholicism. Put another way, historians have come to realize that European history is not simply the working of the rulers on the ruled, but a sort of dance between them, in which each partner sometimes led and sometimes followed. They have also come to realize that great events like the Reformation, wars, revolutions, often took generations to affect the great mass of the people, if at all. One of the reasons Luther and the German princes could get away with starting the Reformation was that most people didn't seem to notice that it was happening. Nothing changed in their churches for quite some time, or in their daily lives for even longer. This reminds us that the great mass of people in early modern Europe never saw the king or Cardinal Richelieu, cared not a fig for political or theological controversies, never read or even heard of Shakespeare or Goethe or Marx. They occupied themselves the way most of us do most of the time, in the mundane business of living. That is, they spent most of their time worrying about the same things that you and I worry about. Growing up, making friends, getting a job, finding the next meal, falling in love, getting married, having children and then worrying for the rest of your life about what's going to happen to them, the aches and pains and illnesses that come with life, and finally, dying and what that might actually mean. The traditional history of wars and treaties, laws and scandals, the one we all learned or were bored by in high school, ignored these stories. We will remember them. By remembering them, we call the people of the past to live again. We give them a kind of immortality. We also remind ourselves that their problems were real, their solutions to those problems not necessarily as crazy as they can sometimes appear to be to us smug moderns. And finally, we remind ourselves that we too will someday be the stuff of history. Therefore, I will be at frequent pains to remind you that the history of Europe is not simply the story of kings and queens or their ministers or their relations with diets or parliaments or estates. It is also the story of every man, woman, and child who lived, loved, fought, and died in Europe during the period covered by our course. This story must be told from the bottom up as well as from the top down. The story must also be told side to side, for European historians have also come to realize that their history cannot be understood outside of the context of the histories of other places. Asia, historians have increasingly come to call the Atlantic world. I want to be clear about this. I repeat, this is a course about Europe. Though America is the intellectual heir of the West, it is too big a topic for this course to address American, Canadian, Mexican, Latin American, or Caribbean history in any detail. Though Africa, Asia, and the Middle East have been profoundly influenced by the West, they deserve histories of their own. These places will enter our story as Europe enters theirs, for good or ill. Finally, this is a story that must be told with a view to what came before, if only because Europe didn't begin in 1500 or 1600. In fact, what this course is really about is how Europeans stopped being medieval and became modern. To understand that, we have to address the medieval inheritance. That brings me to the question of how exactly the course will be structured. The course consists of 48 lectures, divided, after the one I'm giving now, as follows. First, 8 lectures of background. I believe in a lot of pedestal before I erect my statue. We'll begin with the geography of Europe. We'll begin with a sort of Cook's tour of Europe as this course opens. This lecture will explore how geography is, in my view at least, destiny. That is, how and why climate and topography made the development of Western Europe different from that of Eastern Europe, the development of Northern Europe different from that of the South. We'll then look at how European history has been affected by mountain ranges and rivers and bodies of water and islands. And we'll look at Europe's relative distribution of natural resources, water and timber and coal and other minerals. Finally, to give you a better understanding of the physical environment inhabited by early modern Europeans, we're going to pay a visit to a typical, well, non-existently typical, village. We will then continue with a lecture on the mental world of Europeans around 1500. We'll examine their universe, their society, how their economy and politics were supposed to work. This is a lecture on a construct known as the Great Chain of Being. That will be followed by 6 lectures on those developments between 1500 and 1600 or so, which were actually destroying the Great Chain of Being, destroying the old medieval worldview. Those 6 developments are Renaissance humanism, the rise of centrally governed nation states, the discovery of the New World, the invention of the printing press, the Protestant Reformation and the wars of religion that followed from it, the rational and scientific revolutions. It's at that point that we're ready to begin the course proper in terms of the development of modernity. We'll follow the pedestal lectures with lectures on the crisis of the 17th century and a series of wars, sometimes called the Second Hundred Years' War, fought between Britain and France following that crisis. We'll talk about why there was such a crisis. We'll talk about the French response to it, which was to embrace absolutism, the English response, which was to embrace constitutionalism, and why those 2 great political systems had to clash. Those clashes would last right into the 19th century and wouldn't end until Wellington met Napoleon on the field of Waterloo. At stake was the mastery of Europe, imperial control of the Americas, and commercial control of the Far East. Those lectures will be followed by 3 on the Ancien Regime on the verge of the French Revolution. We'll talk about the European class system in the 18th century and how Europeans of all classes lived their lives in the century before that revolution. We'll talk about really basic, mundane things like birth and upbringing and education, courtship and marriage, disease, and how people faced death. We'll then talk about how the philosophers of the Enlightenment sought to reform the Ancien Regime, and we'll talk about 2 very different responses to their writings, those of the enlightened despots of Europe, but also the American Revolution, which provided a blueprint for other revolutions. That reminds me that the next set of lectures, 3 of them, will cover the French Revolution and its aftermath, the Napoleonic Empire. This will be followed by 5 lectures on the Industrial Revolution, its causes, its consequences, the 3 great intellectual responses to it, liberalism, romanticism, and socialism, followed by a lecture on the culture of the 19th century, emphasizing the impact of science on how people thought of man and how people thought of women. This will be followed by 2 lectures on nationalism and its consequences. These will follow revolutions in Greece, France, Italy, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and culminate in the unification of Italy in 1861 and that of Germany in 1871. But they will also take note of the fact that nationalistic tensions continued in the Balkans. That will help to explain why, within half a century, Europe would be plunged into World War I. The next 4 lectures will cover the long-term causes of what Europeans still call the Great War. We'll talk about European imperialism, industrial rivalry during the Second Industrial Revolution, the Anglo-German arms race, Bismarck's European alliance system, which was designed to prevent war, plus there'll be a lecture on the cultural life of Europe at the turn of the 20th century. This will be followed by 4 lectures on the Great War and the Russian Revolution, 1914 to 1918, in which I will make the argument that World War I did to Europe what perhaps Vietnam did to our politics and our culture. This will be followed by 4 lectures on the period between the wars, 1919 to 39, covering the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations, the Great Depression, the rise of the Soviet Union, the rise of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, the approach of World War II. We will then give World War II itself 2 lectures, followed by 2 lectures on post-war Europe, including its reconstruction, the Cold War, the end of European empires and colonialism, the European embrace of democratic socialism, the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of the European Union, and a final lecture on the meaning of European history and civilization, in which I will muster all my wisdom and eloquence. This course intends to provide an understanding of the political, social, and cultural history of Europe over these 5 centuries. But it will also explore the ramifications of that history for the rest of the world, including the United States. This is obviously a terrific story. In the course of these 48 lectures, we will encounter numerous kings, presidents, premiers, and dictators, countless wars, a religious reformation, a scientific, a commercial, a financial, and 4 major political revolutions: the English, the American, the French, the Russian, and we might throw as well the Velvet Revolution, which brought down the Soviet Union and its satellites. Numerous small riots and rebellions, and amazing works of art and culture. Utopia, The Prince, the Sistine Chapel, Don Quixote, King Lear, the King James Bible, Leviathan, Principia, the St. Matthew Passion, the Night Watch, Candide, Diderot's Encyclopedia, Faust, Don Giovanni, Beethoven's symphonies, Frankenstein, Madame Bovary, Impressionism and Realism, The Ring of the Nibelung, Verdi's Falstaff, Mahler's symphonies, The Rite of Spring, The Brothers Karamazov, War and Peace, Ulysses, The Wasteland, The Trial, Guernica, 1984, Night, The Gulag Archipelago. The lives of popes and kings, but also subjects and citizens, including Ferdinand and Isabella, Henry VIII, Francis I, Charles V, Philip II, Columbus, Luther, Galileo, Pascal, Descartes, Michelangelo, James I, Cardinal Richelieu, Gustavus Adolphus, Cromwell, Marlborough, a host of Louis, 13, 14, 15, 16, Newton, Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, Robespierre, Napoleon, Nelson, Wellington, Watt, Brunel, Bessemer, Adam Smith, Malthus, Ricardo, Bentham, Mill, Wollstonecraft, Wordsworth, Blake, Shelley, Goethe, Beethoven, Metternich, Garibaldi, Bismarck, the Kaisers, Nicholas and Alexandra, Gladstone, Disraeli, Florence Nightingale, Darwin, Mendel, Lister, Koch, Hegel, Marx, Einstein, Freud, Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein, Keynes, Lenin, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Churchill, de Gaulle, Adenauer, Brezhnev, the Beatles, Sartre, Fellini, Thatcher, Gorbachev, Milosevic, and John Paul II, as well as a few Americans who left their mark on the Western world. If those names mean anything to you, you must be nearly as excited as I am to be beginning this course. And if they don't, well, I think maybe you need it. Either way, I welcome you to the history of modern Western civilization.